For a human character to reveal truly exceptional qualities, one must have the good fortune to be able to observe its performance over many years. If this performance is devoid of all egoism, if its guiding motive and unparalleled generosity, if it is absolutely certain that there is no thought of recompense, and that, in addition, it has left its visible mark upon the earth, then there can be no mistake. About 40 years ago, I was taking a long trip on foot over mountain heights quite unknown to tourists. In that ancient region where the Alps thrust down into Provence, all this, at the time I embarked upon my long walk through these deserted regions, was barren and colourless land. Nothing grew there but wild lavender. I crossed the area at its widest point, and after 3 days of walking, found myself in the midst of an unparalleled desolation. I camped near the vestiges of an abandoned village. I had run out of water the day before and had to find some. These clustered houses, although in ruins, like an old wasp nest, suggested that there was once had been a spring or well here. There was indeed a spring, but it was dry. The 5 or 6 houses, roofless, gnawed by wind and rain, the tiny chapel and its crumbling steeple, stood about like the houses and chapels in living villages. But all life had vanished. It was a fine June day, brilliant with sunlight, but over this unsheltered land, high in the sky, the wind blew with an unendurable ferocity. It growled over the carcasses of the houses like a lion disturbed at its meal. I had to move my camp. After 5 hours walking, I had still not found water, and there was nothing to give me any hope of finding any. All about me was the same dryness, the same coarse grasses. I thought I glimpsed in the distance a small black silhouette upright, and took it for the trunk or a solitary tree. In any case, I started toward it. It was a shepherd. 30 sheep were lying about him on the baking earth. He gave me a drink from his water gourd, and a little later took me into his cottage in a fold of the plain. He drew his water, excellent water, from a very deep natural well above which he had constructed a primitive winch. The man spoke little. This is the way of those who live alone. But one felt that he was sure of himself, and confident in his assurance. That was unexpected in this barren country. He lived not in a cabin, but in a real house built of stone that bore plain evidence of how his own effort had reclaimed the ruin he had found there on his arrival. His roof was strong and sound. The wind on its tiles made the sound of the sea upon its shore. The place was in order, the dishes washed, the floor swept, his rifle oiled. His soup was boiling over the fire. I noticed then that he was cleanly shaven, that all his buttons were firmly sewn on, that his clothing had been mended with the meticulous care that makes the mending invisible. He shared his soup with me, and afterwards, when I offered my tobacco pouch, he told me that he did not smoke. His dog, as silent as himself, was friendly, without being servile. It was understood from the first that I should spend the night there. The nearest village was still more than a day and a half away, and besides, I was perfectly familiar with the nature of the rare villages in that region. There were 4 or 5 of them scattered well apart from each other on those mountain slopes, among white oak thickets, at the extreme end of the wagon roads. They were inhabited by charcoal burners, and the living was bad. Families crowded together in a climate that is excessively harsh both in winter and in summer, found no escape from the unceasing conflict of personalities. Irrational ambition reached inordinate proportions in the continual desire for escape. The men took their wagon loads of charcoal to the town, then returned. The soundest characters broke under the perpetual grind. The women nursed their grievances. There was rivalries in everything, over the price of charcoal, as over a pew in the church. over the wearing virtues as over the wearing vices, as well as over the ceaseless combat between virtue and vice. And over all there was the wind, also ceaseless, the rasp upon the nerves. There was epidemics of suicide and frequent cases of insanity, usually homicidal. The shepherd went to fetch a small sack and poured out a heap of acorns on the table. He began to inspect them one by one with great concentration, separating the good from the bad. I smoked my pipe. I did offer to help him. He told me that it was his job. And in fact, seeing the care he devoted to the task, I did not insist. That was the whole of our conversation. When he had set aside a large enough pile of good acorns, he counted them out by tens, meanwhile eliminating the small ones or those which were slightly cracked. For now he examined them more closely. When he had thus selected 100 perfect acorns, he stopped and he went to bed. There was peace in being with this man. The next day I asked if I might rest here for the day. He found it quite natural, or, to be more exact, he gave me the impression that nothing could startle him. The rest was not absolutely necessary, but I was interested and wished to know more about him. He opened the pen and led his flock to pasture. Before leaving, he plunged his sack of carefully selected and counted acorns into a pail of water. I noticed that he carried for a stick of an iron rod, as thick as my thumb, and about 1.5 yards long. Resting myself by walking, I followed a path parallel to his. His pasture was in a valley. He left the dog in charge of the little flock and climbed towards where I stood. I was afraid that he was about to rebuke me for my indiscretion, but it was not that at all. This was the way he was going, and he invited me to go along if I had nothing better to do. He climbed to the top of the ridge, about 100 yards away. There he began thrusting his rod into the earth, making a hole in which he planted an acorn. Then he refilled the hole. He was planting oak trees. I asked if the land belonged to him. He answered no. Did he know whose it was? He did not. He supposed it was community property, or perhaps belonged to people who cared nothing about it. He was not interested in finding out whose it was. He planted his hundreds of acorns with the greatest care. After the midday meal he resumed his planting. I suppose it must have been fairly insistent on the questioning, for he answered me. For 3 years he had been planting trees in this wilderness. He had planted 100,000 trees. Of the 100,000, 20,000 had sprouted. Of the 20,000, he still expected to lose about half. The rodents, or to the unpredictable design of Providence. These remained 10,000 oak trees to grow there. Nothing had grown before. That was when I began to wonder about the age of this man. He was obviously over 50. 55, he told me. His name was Elzird Bofiar. He had once had a farm in the lowlands. There he had had his life. He had lost his only son, then his wife. He had withdrawn into this solitude, where his pleasure was to live leisurely with his lambs and his dog. It was his opinion that this land was dying for want of trees. He added that, having no very pressure business of his own, he had resolved to remedy this state of affairs. Since I was at this time, in spite of my youth, leading a solitary life, I understood how to deal gently with solitary spirits. But my very youth forced me to reconsider the future in relation to myself and to a certain quest for happiness. I told him that in 30 years his 10,000 oak would be magnificent. He answered quite simply that if God granted him life in 30 years, he would have planted so many more, that then these 10,000 would be more like a drop of water in the ocean. Besides, He was now studying the reproduction of beech trees and had a nursery of seedlings growing by the beech nuts near his cottage. The seedlings, which he had protected from his sheep with a wire fence, were very beautiful. He was also considering birches for the valleys where he told me there were a certain amount of moisture a few yards below the surface of the soil. The next day we parted. The following year came, the War of 1914, in which I was involved for the next 5 years. An infantryman hardly had time to reflect upon trees, to tell the truth. The thing itself had made no impression upon me. I had considered it as a hobby, a stamp collection, and forgotten it. The war was over. I found myself possessed of a tiny, demobilized bonus and a huge desire to breathe fresh air for a while. It was with no other objective that I again took the road to the barren lands. The countryside had not changed. However, beyond the deserted villages, I glimpsed in the distance a sort of greyish mist that covered the mountain tops like a carpet. Since the day before, I had begun to think again of the shepherd tree planter. 10,000 oaks, I reflected, really take up quite a bit of space. I had seen too many men die during those 5 years, not to imagine easily that Elzéard Bouffard was dead, especially since, at 20, one regards men of 50 as old men with nothing left to do but die. He was not dead, as a matter of fact. He was extremely spry. He had changed job. Now he had only 4 sheep, but instead 100 beehives. He had got rid of the sheep because they threatened his young trees. For, he told me, and I saw for myself, the war had disturbed him not at all. He had imperturbably continued to plant. The oaks of 1910 were then 10 years old and taller than either of us. It was an impressive spectacle. I was literally speechless, and, as he did not talk, we spent the whole day walking in silence through this forest. In 3 sections it measured 11 kilometers in length and 3 kilometers at its greatest width. When you remember that all this had sprung from the hands and the soul of this one man without technical resources, you understood that men could be as effectual as God in other realms than that of destruction. He had pursued his plan, and beech trees as high as my shoulder, spread out as far as the eye could reach, confirmed it. He showed me handsome clumps of birch planted 5 years before, that is, in 1915, when I had been fighting in Verdun. He had set them out in all the valleys where he had guessed, and rightly, that there was moisture, almost at the surface of the ground. They were as delicate as young girls, and very well established. Creation seemed to come about in a sort of chain reaction. He did not worry about it. He was determinedly pursuing his task in all its simplicity. But as we went back towards the village, I saw water flowing in brooks that had been dry since the memory of man. This was the most impressive result of chain reaction that I had seen. These dry streams had once long ago run with water. Some of the dreary villages I mentioned before had been built on the sites of ancient Roman settlements, traces of which still remain, and archaeologists exploring there had found fishhooks where, in the 20th century, cisterns were needed to assure a small supply of water. The wind too scattered seeds. As the water reappeared, so there reappeared willows, rushes, meadows, gardens, flowers, and a certain purpose in being alive. But the transformation took place so gradually that it became part of the pattern without causing any astonishment. Hunters climbing into the wilderness in pursuit of hares or wild boar had of course noticed the sudden growth of little trees, but had attributed it to some natural caprice of the earth. That is why no one meddled with Elzéard Bouffard's work. If he had been detected, he would have been opposition. He was undetectable. Who in the villages or in the administration could have dreamed of such perseverance in a magnificent generosity. To have anything like a precise idea of this exceptional character, one must not forget that he worked in total solitude, so total that, toward the end of his life, he lost the habit of speech, or perhaps it was that he saw no need for it. In 1933, he received a visit from a forest ranger who notified him of an order against lighting fires out of doors for fear of endangerment of the growth of the natural forest. It was the first time the man told him, naively, that he had ever heard of a forest growing of its own accord. At that time, Beaufort was about to plant beeches at a spot some 12 kilometers from his cottage in order to avoid traveling back and forth, for he was 75. He planned to build a stone cabin right at the plantation. The next year he did so. In 1935, a whole delegation came from the government to examine the natural forest. There was a high official from the Forest Service, a deputy technicians. There was a great deal of ineffectual talk. It was decided that something must be done, and fortunately, nothing was done except the only helpful thing. The whole forest was placed under the protection of the state, and charcoal burning prohibited, for it was impossible not to be captivated by the beauty of those young trees in the fullness of health, and they cast their spell over the deputy himself. A friend of mine was among the forestry officers. To him I explained the mystery. One day, the following week, he went together to see Elziard Beaufort. We found him hard at work, some 10 kilometers from the spot where the inspection had taken place. This forester was not my friend for nothing. He was aware of values. He knew how to keep silent. I delivered the eggs I had brought as a present. We shared our lunch among the three of us and spent several hours in wordless contemplation of the countryside. In the direction from which we had come, the slopes were covered with trees 20 to 25 feet tall. I remembered how the land had looked in 1913. A desert. Peaceful. Regular toil. The vigorous mountain air. Frugality, and above all, serenity of spirit had endowed this old man with awe-inspiring health. He was one of God's athletes. I wondered how many more acres he was going to cover with trees. Before leaving, my friend simply made a brief suggestion about certain species of trees that the soil here seemed particularly suited for. He did not force the point. For the very good reason, he told me later, that Beaufort knows more about it than I do. At the end of an hour's walking, having turned it over in my mind, he added, "He knows a lot more about it than anybody. He's discovered a wonderful way to be happy." It was thanks to this officer that not only the forest but also the happiness of the man was protected. He delegated 3 rangers to the task, and so terrorized them that they remained proof against all the bottles of wine and charcoal burners could offer. The only serious danger to the work occurred during the war in 1939, as cars were being run on gasogens, wood-burning generators. There was never enough wood. Cutting was started among the oaks in 1910, but the area was so far from any retail roads that the enterprise turned out to be financially unsound. It was abandoned. The shepherd had seen nothing of it. He was 30 kilometers away, peacefully continuing his work, ignoring the war of 39 as he had ignored that of 14. I saw Elziard Beaufort for the last time in June of 1945. He was then 87. I had started back along the route, through the wastelands, but now, in spite of the disorder in which the war had left the country, there was a bus running between the Durance Valley and the mountain. I attributed the fact that I no longer recognized the scenes of my familiar journeys to this relatively speedy transportation. It seemed to me, too, that the route took me through new territory. It took the name of a village to convince me that I was actually in the region that had been all in ruins and desolate. The bus put me down at Vergons in 1913. This hamlet of 10 or 12 houses had 3 inhabitants. They had been savage creatures, hating one another, living by trapping game, little removed, but physically and morally, from the conditions and prehistoric man. All about them, nettles were feeding upon the remains of abandoned houses. Their condition had been beyond hope. For them, nothing but to wait death, a situation which rarely predisposed of virtue. Everything was changed, even the air. Instead of the harsh dry winds that used to attack me, a gentle breeze was blowing, laden with scents. A sound like water came from the mountains. It was the wind in the forest. Most amazing of all, I heard the actual sound of water falling into a pool. I saw that a fountain had been built, that it flowed freely, and what touched me most, that someone had planted a linden beside it. A linden that must have been 4 years old, already in full leaf. The inconstatable symbol of resurrection. Besides, Vergons bore evidence of labour at the sort of undertaking for which hope is required. Hope, then, had returned. Ruins had been cleared away. Dilapidated walls torn down and 5 houses restored. Now there were 28 inhabitants, 4 of them young married couples. The new houses, freshly plastered, were surrounded by gardens where vegetables and flowers grew in orderly confusion. Cabbages and roses, leeks and snapdragons, celery and anemones. It was now a village where one could live and like to live. From that point on, I went on foot. The war just finished had not yet allowed the full blooming of life, but Lazarus was out of the tomb. On the lower slopes of the mountain, I saw little fields of barley and rye. Deep in the narrow valleys, the meadows were turning green. It was taken only the 8 years since then for the whole countryside to glow with health and prosperity. On the site of ruins I had seen in 1913, now stand neat farms, cleanly plastered, testifying to a happy and comfortable life. The old streams, fed by the rains and snows that the forest conserved, are flowing again. Their waters have been channeled. On each farm, engrooved of maples, fountain pools flow onto the carpets of fresh mint. Little by little, the villages had been rebuilt. People from the plains, where land is costly, have settled here, bringing youth, motion, the spirit of adventure. Along the roads you meet hearty men and women, boys and girls, who understand laughter and have recovered a taste for picnics. Counting the former population unrecognizable now that they live in comfort, more than 10,000 people owe their happiness to Elziard Beaufire. When I reflect that one man, armed only with his own physical and moral resources, was able to cause this land of Canaan to spring from the wasteland, I am convinced that in spite of everything, humanity is admirable. But when I compute the unfailing greatness of spirit and the tenacity of benevolence that it must have taken to achieve this result, I am taken with an immense respect for that old and unlearned peasant who was able to complete a work worthy of God. Elzior Beaufort died peacefully in 1947 at the hospice in Banon. Afterworld. I mustered enough courage to call upon Jean Gione in Monosque province at 11 a.m., August 15th, 1970. His older daughter, Aline Gione, down from Paris for a few days, ushered me into the garden of their hillside home. Then, dying from heart disease, Gione sat at the table, unable to walk away more. He told me at once. I could not believe his cultured voice, for I knew that he was self-taught. I have never recovered from the sight of man. He was positively stunning, slender, silver-haired, elegant with delicate features, rosy cheeks, hooded blue eyes, casually dressed in tan slacks and mauve shirt. Without any hesitation, he rushed into a dazzling discussion with me about books, critics, authors, Provence, his home, his life, his creativity. He begged me to stay and made me promise to return. I left that first day loaded down with the gifts of his unpublished and privately published works, which I sent immediately to Butler Library, Columbia University. Less than 2 months later, Jean Giorno died midway through his 75th year. Giorno lived virtually his entire life in the little city of Monosque. His elderly father was a cobbler, and his mother, he tells us in his early novel, John Le Bleu, Blue Boy, ran a hand laundry. This family of 3 residents in the poorest of tenements, where the child had only a blue view down into a wall or a country yard. At age 16, becoming sole support of the family, Giorno left school and went to clerk in a bank. 18 years later, in 1929, he published his first 2 novels, Colin, Hill of Destiny, and Unde Baumugnes, Lovers Are Never Losers. I'm sorry about that pronunciation. Both rave successes, in part thanks to the instant sponsorship of André Gide. Years afterwards, Giorno recalled the turning point of his life, that moment in the afternoon of December 20th, 1901, when he could spare enough pennies to purchase the cheapest book he could find. It turned out to be a copy of Virgil's poems. He never forgot that first flush of his own creativity energy. My heart soared. Giorno laughingly said people in Paris sent him questionnaires because they did not want to read his books. But if we look at one of the documentaries, he answered, we can hear him speak in his usual teasing voice and mood. My ideal of happiness? Peace. My favorite fictional hero? Don Quixote. My favorite historical character? Machiavelli. My heroines in real life? There are no heroines in real life. My painter? Goya. My musician? Mozart. My poet? Villon. Baudelaire. My color? Red. My flower? The narcissus. My chief character trait? Generosity. Faithfulness. My chief fault? The generous lie. What I want to be? Lenient. My preferred occupation? Writing. Knowing his unique, exceptional, and in fact, idiosyncratic patterns of thought, I am not surprised that Giorno ran into difficulties with the American editors, who in 1953 asked him to write a few pages about the unforgettable character. Apparently, the publishers required a story about an actual unforgettable character, while Giorno chose to write some pages about that character which to him would be most unforgettable. When what he wrote met with the objection, and no Beaufire had died in the shelter at Banon, a tiny mountain hamlet, Giono donated his pages to the Sundry. Not long after the story was rejected, it was accepted by Vogue and published in March 1954 as The Man Who Planted Hope and Grew Happiness. Giono later wrote, an American admirer of the tale, that his purpose in creating Beaufire was to make people love the tree, or more precisely, to make them love planting trees. Within a few years, the story of Elzéard Beaufire swept around the world and was translated into at least a dozen languages. It has long since inspired reforestation efforts worldwide. We see from the opening sentence of the story how Giono interpreted the world character and individuality, unforgettability, is unselfish, generous beyond measures, leaving on earth its mark without thought of reward. Giono believed he left his mark on earth when he wrote Elzéard Beaufire's story, because he gave it away for the good of others, heedless of payment. It is one of my stories of which I am the proudest. It does not bring me in one single penny, and that is why it has accomplished what it was written for. The Man Who Planted Trees, the author's adventure, commenced in June 1913 during a walking tour through Julius Caesar's ancient Rome province, still so-called province, as Giono trudged along the wild, deserted high plateau. He heard the wind growl like a lion over the ruins, which lay like black carcasses and rush like ocean waves over the high country. Fearful and exposed, he saw mirages like the gaunt, black silhouettes of a grieving woman. He mistook for a dead tree. He met a shepherd, a pastor, ministering to sleep. One of those solitary men associated from all time with congregations and providence. By the end of the World War I, this same shepherd had become a beekeeper who already resembled God, more narrowly by his power to create a new earth. He was planting oaks, beeches and birches. Miraculously, water was conserved. Dry stream beds filled again. The seeds germinated into gardens, meadows and flowers. In 1933, this planter of trees of 75 years of age was clearly one of God's athletes. After World War II, the author saw new villages in Connaught, where in 1913 all had lain waste. The shepherd had performed his solitary work, which Giono hoped he also had done. Both hoped to be worthy of God. The name Elzéard calls to mind some forgotten Hebrew prophet, wise man, an Oriental king. The last name means in both French and English something grandiose, beaufi, beaufait, that is, puffed up like a great man, puffed out like wind or a cloud in the sky. Such an old hero appears remarkably in most of Giono's early fiction, often a shepherd, or else some venerable alcoholic storyteller, old hired man, or knife sharpener, but also escorted by beasts, sheep, bees, a bull, a stag, a toad, or a serpent. Such lonely old men, in their delirium, directly hear the voice of God, or that of some ageless Greek divinity such as the great Pan. One must think of these ferocious gifted old men as embodying the creative God themselves, as native survivalists and survivals in their ancient province, to which they continuously brought their wisdom, their knowledge of agriculture, their message of life and instructability, all of them teaching like the Titan Dionysus, the precious secret of humanity, ancient kindship with the earth. From the 1920s, Giono continually praised this harmony whereby human beings conserved and enriched the earth, where they coexisted with animals, both enriched by the silent but responsive living vegetable kingdom. Giono also praised work done in solitude, where creation originates, and especially in mankind, where the free expression of compassion and pity begins. When we express pity, Giono used to say, as for a living river cut off by dams, or pity for the helpless, suffering beast killed by cruel humankind, then we ourselves resemble an ancient yellow god who still look down on us from Olympus. Should we not extend our compassion to the forest before it is felled by the woodcutters? This was not original in French literature, of course, but could have come to the child. Giono, as he read the fables of La Fontaine in school, his thinking was reinforced by his favorite American apostle of nature, Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau. We are probably accustomed to regional authors who express their love for animals and who encourage us to treat them with kindness and respect. Giono aside, we are less used to those writers who look upon the plant kingdom as coequal with the animal kingdom. We have begun to recognize a new fellowship with the silent vegetable world, because it purifies and renews the earth about us, because it confronts us, and because it reconciles us to death. In Solitude de la Pitié, 1932, Giono illustrates all of this by telling us a whole series of tragicomical stories. Once upon a time there was, he tells us, a feeble old country fellow named Geoffroy, who sold his peach orchard to his neighbours, Fonts, in order to purchase an annuity for himself and his flustered old wife Barbe, fine until the day Fonts decided that the peach tree were diseased and old, and furthermore decided to cut them down. Then, in utter despair, Geoffrey set aside and set about attempting to take his own life, but was always frustrated by Barbe. Geoffrey never could stop explaining to anyone who would listen that these were his own trees, which he had planted and watered by hand, and still owned, and owned forever. In another tale from his collection, a tale I think of in English as In the Woodcutter's Country, Giono tells how a young shepherd one day came to call on his friend Firmin, way up in the isolated hill country. The two friends finally could not stand to hear Firmin's wife crying in labour, so they walked all the way down into the village, uprooted a large cypress, and lugged it back up the hills to home. They planted it by the front door, where Madeleine could hear it singing to the wind. Her baby was christened in its shade. The tree burbled in the dry wind storms like a stream of water in heaven. Firmin passed on. Madeleine passed on. The boy never came back from war. The tree is still there. In his wonderful story of Elzéar Beaufort, Giono frankly seemed to have intended to inspire a reforestation program that would renew the whole earth. His history of this imaginary shepherd, which is a compliment to Americans because of its relationship to the real Johnny Appleseed, calmly veers away from past and present time toward the future of newer and better generations. Giono termed his confidence in the future esperance, or hopefulness, not aspire or espoir, which is the masculine word for hope, but esperance, the feminine word, designated the permanent state of condition of living one's life in hopeful tranquility. Whence springs this well of esperance? Giorno wondered. Hopefulness must spring, he decided, from literature and the profession of poetry. Authors only write so that fair about it. They have an obligation to profess hopefulness in return for the right to live and to write. The poet must know the magical effect of certain words: hay, grass, meadows, rivers, firs, mountains, hills. People have suffered so long inside walls that they have gotten to be free. Giorno thought. Human beings were not created to live forever in subways, tenements, for their feet long to stride through tall grass or slide through running water. The poet's mission is to remind us of beauty of trees swaying in the breeze, or pines growing and groaning under snow on the mountain passes, of wild white horses galloping across the surf. You know, Giorno said to me, there are also times in life when a person has to rush off in pursuit of hopefulness. During his lifetime, John Giorno, who considered himself to be Italian and Provençal, in addition to French, was judged one of the greatest writers of age by such authorities and authors as Henri Payre and André Malraux. Both Payre and Malraux ranked Giorno first or second in French 20th century literature. Giorno, Monterland, and Marlowe, who included himself. Longevity counts most for an author, and Giorno's works are still being edited and published after 56 years. Giorno wrote over 30 novels, numerous essays, scores of stories, many of which were published as collections, plays and film scripts. In 1953, he was awarded the Prix Monesquieu. This was for his collection work and collective work. And in 1954, he was elected to the Academia Goncourt, whose 10 numbers awards the annual Prix Goncourt.